difference between presidential and parliamentary systems is how is the executive elected. And what is the relationship between executive and legislative? In presidential systems, the executive is directly elected by the people. The American president, the traditional presidential system, is directly elected. It's a bit more complicated because you have the Electoral College, that's an old US institutions which we can ignore for the moment, but basically the people of the US choose who their president is. The people of Germany do not necessarily choose who their chancellor is, right? So because they choose political parties, and the political party that then form a coalition government, they decide who the chancellor is. So when the executive is directly elected, it also tends to have more power. Why? Because it has popular sovereignty. It has popular legitimacy, right? It is based on the will of the people. And so in presidential systems, the presidents tend to be quite powerful. There are exceptions to this. Of course, Austria would be an example, directly elected president, relatively limited powers. But most presidential systems have strong executives. The advantage of this is A, many people say it's more democratic. People choose who will be in charge of them. B, some people suggest it's also more, especially for divided countries, ethnically heterogeneous countries, it tends to favor moderate candidates. In the sense that if you, for example, put special rules in place to say president needs to be elected by a certain majority in Nigeria, the president needs to not only get an absolute majority of votes, but they also need to get a majority of the different territories of the different states. So you always end up getting a moderate. You don't get a radical who only pushes for one group, but they rely on the votes of different groups. Then the presidential system can be moderating as well. In many democratizing countries, there is this argument we need a strong executive, a person who can unite the country. The evidence suggests that for most democratizing countries, actually having a presidential system might not be the best idea. We are currently finding out also in the US that maybe presidential systems are quite problematic because they can be contested, because they tend to easier slip into authoritarian systems. And that Donald Trump and his inability to accept defeat is a good example for that. And imagine you wouldn't have the independent judiciary you have in the US, you wouldn't have the checks and balances and the old established democratic framework that the US have. And I very much predict there will be a peaceful transfer of power in the US. But imagine you don't have all of these structures. You have a young democracy. You have a president in power who's really popular. But for example, the constitution says the president can only serve 2 terms. And now this person says, no, I want to do a third term. So you begin to undermine democratic structures. This is why many people say actually in a democratizing country, in a transition country, you should have more parliamentary system where the executive is based, comes out of the majority of the legislative of the parliament. There is a big debate about are presidential systems good for diverse societies. As I said earlier, some people say if you have an electoral system where a president doesn't just need a simple majority, but needs a majority like in Nigeria, majority of people and a majority of states or of territories, it moderates the candidates. Because the candidates can't go around saying, vote for me, I represent your ethnic group, because they know they need votes from other ethnic groups. So they will say, I will be a president of everyone, and I will make sure everybody is included, and we will be tolerant, and right. So there is this argument that a presidential system can create a uniting figure, a more moderate figure that brings the country together. And many transition countries want that. They want this figure, we want a figure to bring the country together. But then when you ask people in Syria, for example, also in post-intervention in Iraq, in many other democratizing countries, who is that integrating figure? Very often people don't agree on one name. And this is also this misconception like every country has a Nelson Mandela. And I think that is a fundamentally wrong perception. That South Africa was lucky enough to have a Nelson Mandela. Most countries don't. And that's not to do with the fact that most countries don't have skilled leaders, but to have that mixture of political experience, of imprisonment, and of willingness to accept democracy and to reach out to the oppressor that Nelson Mandela had. We don't find that in many countries. So this is why in most transition countries where presidential systems have been tried, they have undermined democracy and they have resulted in potentially new authoritarian structures, or indeed they have resulted in new internal fighting, where people then, well, the president is too powerful and there's no cooperation with the opposition. South Sudan is a very good example here.